Public sentiment is not observed. The wealthy and powerful gain a ready hearing, but the plodding, suffering, unorganized, complaining multitude are spurned and derided. James B. Weaver.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here, and today we'll take a look at national politics during the Gilded Age. In recent weeks, we've looked in depth at the economic developments that defined the Second Industrial Revolution in America. We've seen the American city come into its own, and the wealth gap become increasingly pronounced. But what was the federal government up to during the late 1800s? And how did the political parties respond to the rapidly changing landscape? Today, we'll find out. But first, a big question. Is populism an effective political strategy? Generally speaking, populism is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people, usually by uniting them against elite or established groups. The antagonization of elite classes is a key component in populist politics, which can come from either side of the political spectrum. And while the approach first proved effective in the 19th century, it has witnessed a global resurgence in recent decades. A religious and nationalist brand of populism has characterized India in recent years. Brazil elected a left-wing populist president in 2002 and a right-wing populist in 2018. Populism drove the anti-globalist Brexit movement in the United Kingdom, and Donald Trump rode populism to the White House by turning his voting base against the swamp, his name for the American political establishment in 2016. Populism tends to appear in waves, and usually in response to some kind of crisis, whether real or perceived. In the late 1800s, that crisis was the broken politics and unequal economic system of the Gilded Age. But is populism an effective way to govern for the majority? Or does it simply play on its frustration and fears? Let's take a look. Our first big idea will provide some historical context by establishing the trends of the two major parties through most of the Gilded Age. Following Reconstruction, the Republican and Democratic parties relied more on history and patronage than ideology. Both parties grew friendly towards big business, and both largely ignored the plight of the everyday American. When Reconstruction ended in the 1870s, the dynamics of the third-party system began to change. The greatest pivot came from the Republicans. When Northern citizens lost interest in imposing their will on the defeated South, the Republican Party shifted its focus to Northern industry. In order to promote its growth, they adopted a laissez-faire economic approach. This actually brought both major parties closer together ideologically. Both favored limited federal government involvement in economic and social affairs. Because the two parties were not separated by ideology, they turned to other appeals to get votes. One of these was history. Republicans relished in being the party of Lincoln and the Union. They used the memory of the Civil War to villainize Democrats. The fraction of the African American population that had not been disenfranchised by Jim Crow remained steadfastly loyal to the Republican Party, largely for this reason. Democrats fortified their base of support in the American South by channeling their Jeffersonian roots, their tradition as the party of the South, and, of course, segregation. But besides history, the parties also used more tangible means of ensuring party loyalty: patronage. Patronage is the practice of awarding government jobs based on party loyalty rather than merit. Patronage was an effective tool at federal, state, and local levels. Democratic Party machines were particularly effective at using the power of patronage in major urban centers across America. Now, the key to all this is that neither party through the Gilded Age was particularly interested in doing much of anything. And as a result, industry and big business ran roughshod over average Americans. Our second big idea introduces populism as a consequence of this development. The Populist Party grew out of a coalition of Americans whose interests had been neglected by the major political parties. The populist goal was to provide for these people and wrestle power from corrupt political and commercial institutions. Indeed, the do-nothing approach of the major political parties left many Americans frustrated with their government, and a number of grassroots organizations emerged between the 1860s and 1890s to call for change. Farmers in the West and South faced falling prices and rising costs thanks to railroad and manufacturing monopolies. In the late 1860s, they orchestrated the Granger movement, which lobbied the government for farmer-friendly legislation, like laws that lowered railroad rates. In 1875, they established the Farmers' Alliance, which further amplified many of these objectives and encouraged cooperation among farmers to promote economic success. In the cities, urban workers formed labor unions like the Knights of Labor and American Federation of Labor in order to collectively bargain for workers' rights and higher wages. Farmers and factory workers backed a new political party in the 1870s and 80s known as the Greenbacks. The party was so named because it wanted to replace the gold standard with fiat paper currency known as greenbacks. Such a move would cause nationwide inflation and would help millions escape the vicious cycle of debt in which they had become trapped. Other disgruntled groups included socialists who were appalled at the economic inequality that laissez-faire capitalism had produced, and nativists who were growing increasingly frustrated with the influx of immigrants into the labor market. Now, on their own, none of these organizations gained much momentum, but political operatives recognized in the 1890s that together they commanded a significant block of voters, especially in the West. In 1892, the People's Party, more commonly known as the Populist Party, was formed. The Populists appealed to Americans who had been disaffected by the conditions of the late 1800s. They saw the Gilded Age as a struggle between corrupt political and business leaders and the ordinary Americans they were taking advantage of. Their 1892 party platform, known as the Omaha Platform, proposed sweeping changes to the American economic and political system. One of the key tenets of the Omaha Platform was the unlimited coinage of silver. While this was not the removal of the gold standard like the Greenbacks wanted, it would accomplish basically the same result. By circulating new currency backed by silver, the money supply would increase, causing inflation. Inflation would raise crop prices, making it easier for farmers to pay their debts. For more on this type of monetary policy and how it affects our economy, consider enrolling in AP Macroeconomics next year. The Omaha Platform also called for a graduated income tax, which would attempt to address the wealth gap by taxing the rich at higher rates than the poor. The Populists called for the nationalization of major industries, including railroads and communications. They wanted the government to seize critical infrastructure away from predatory corporations who were taking advantage of farmers and other ordinary Americans. The Omaha Platform also called for the creation of a federal crop storage program that would decrease the available crop supply, thereby increasing prices and profits. For urban workers, Populists wanted a federally mandated 8-hour workday and restrictions on immigration to keep the labor supply from climbing out of control. Populists also recognized that corruption threatened the government's ability to protect the average American, so they advocated for measures to increase democracy, putting less power in the hands of politicians and political parties and more in the hands of the people. These included the direct election of senators, referendums, initiatives, recalls, and term limits for several federal offices. So, as we can see, the Populist Platform called for sweeping reforms. The diversity of the populist demands reflect their attempts to appeal to a diverse base. The platform offered a great deal for farmers, but also urban workers, socialists, and nativists. Populists were hopeful that their efforts to reach this coalition would pay off at the polls. But while the Populists did make some noise at the election of 1892, they ultimately could not sustain their momentum. This is our third big idea. The Populist Party had a strong showing in 1892, but fizzled after nominating William Jennings Bryan for president in 1896. In the 1892 presidential election, Populist nominee James Weaver earned 9% of the popular vote and picked up electoral votes in 6 states, including Kansas. And while the Populists didn't come close to putting their candidate in the White House, their showing was nonetheless impressive. For a brand new third party to collect electoral votes in multiple states and seat 14 members of Congress is no small accomplishment. The populist turnout in 1892 also caught the attention of the major parties. In response to populist success, in 1896, the Democratic Party nominated William Jennings Bryan for president. Bryan was popular with populists, mainly because he was a vocal advocate of adding silver to the money supply. In his famous Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention, Bryan argued that the gold standard placed undue burden on average Americans. The Democrats' choice of Bryan forced populists to choose between nominating their own candidate or backing William Jennings Bryan. They chose to throw their weight behind Bryan, but even their support wasn't enough to put him over the top. He lost to Republican William McKinley, who swept the North. The decision to back Bryan effectively ended the Populist Party, as they never again produced a viable candidate for president. So, why did the Populist Party ultimately fail? Contemporaries and historians point out that the party's base might have been too diverse. The party was popular among farmers and socialists, but it didn't capture urban workers like the party leadership had hoped. This famous political cartoon from 1891 captures the essence of this problem. Rather than being guided by a single coherent ideology, the Populist Party was a patchwork of smaller organizations and interest groups that didn't always fit together well. Additionally, the Populist platform was well ahead of its time. They proposed some sweeping changes to heavily entrenched Gilded Age institutions. Most Americans were just not yet ready for the type of government expansion that the Populists were calling for. Their political doom may well have been a result of wanting too much, too fast. So, if the Populists never really won anything, why do they even matter? Well, 2 reasons. First, the populist movement got the attention of the major parties, who went on to adopt some of the populist major policy goals. The populists proved that while third parties may not be able to put a candidate in the White House, they can achieve policy objectives by making noise in elections. Second, the populists paved the way for more challengers to the status quo in the early 20th century. The legacy of the Omaha platform is undeniable. Just look at all the stated objectives that were eventually implemented. The graduated income tax that populists called for was established in 1913. The federal government stepped in and provided assistance to farmers in the form of subsidies, incentives, and loans throughout the 20th century. The 8-hour workday was mandated first for railroad workers in 1916, then for all citizens in 1938 and 1940. Immigration limitations were implemented in the 1920s. The direct election of senators was passed in 1913. Democracy was further increased through the referendum, initiative, and recall in the 1910s, and a term limit for the president was established by constitutional amendment in 1947. It did take a while, but many of the populist goals were achieved by their successors. The rise and fall of the Populist Party may have been but a fleeting moment in American history, but its impact stretches far beyond the party's tangible accomplishments. The Populists may even have been the inspiration for one of America's most timeless stories. Take a look.
In the summer of 1963, a high school teacher changed the way the world looked at The Wizard of Oz. His name was Henry Littlefield, and he was teaching an American history class. He'd made it to the late 19th century, a time called the Gilded Age. but he was struggling to keep his class interested in the complex social and economic issues of the time. Then one night, while he was reading The Wonderful Wizard of Oz to his daughters, he had an idea. In the 1890s, farmers wanted to add silver to the gold standard to put more money in circulation and make it easier for farmers to borrow. In the book, Dorothy walked to the Emerald City on the yellow brick road in her silver shoes. The movie's ruby red slippers started out as silver. Silver and gold on the road to prosperity. L. Frank Baum had published the book in 1900 at the height of the Gilded Age, and the analogy didn't seem out of the question. No one else had seen these connections, but that didn't deter Littlefield. He taught his class about the Gilded Age using the book, and soon he and his students were finding more connections. For instance, in the late 1890s, the U.S. had recently recovered from the Civil War and integrated vast new territories, bringing an era of prosperity for some. But while industry and finance in the North and East prospered, farmers across the South and Midwest struggled. This led to the Populist movement, uniting farmers and workers against urban elites. By 1896, the movement had grown into the People's Party, and its support of Democrat William Jennings Bryan put him in reach of the presidency. Meanwhile, in Oz, claimed Littlefield, Dorothy is a typical American girl whose hard life in Kansas is literally turned upside down by powerful forces outside her control. The Munchkins are the common people oppressed by the Witch of the East, banks and monopolies. The Scarecrow is the farmer, considered naive, but actually quite resourceful. The Tin Woodman is the industrial worker, dehumanized by factory labor. And the Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan, who could be an influential figure if only he were brave enough to adopt the Populists' radical program. Together, they travel along a golden yellow road towards a grand city whose ruler's power turns out to be built on illusions. Littlefield published some of these observations in an essay. His claim that this fantasy was actually a subversive critique of American capitalism appealed to many people in the 1960s. Other scholars took up the theme, and the proposed analogies and connections multiplied. They suggested that Dorothy's dog Toto represented the teetotalers of the Prohibition Party. Oz was clearly the abbreviation for ounces, an important unit in the silver debate. The list goes on. By the 1980s, this understanding of the book was accepted so widely that several American history textbooks mentioned it in discussions of late 19th century politics. But is the theory right? L. Frank Baum's introduction claims the book is just an innocent children's story. Could he have been deliberately throwing people off the trail? And is it fair to second-guess him so many decades later? There's no definitive answer, which is part of why authorial intent is a complex, tangled, fun question to unravel. And some recent scholars have interpreted The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in the opposite way as Littlefield. They claim it's a celebration of the new urban consumer culture. Historian William Leach argued that the dazzling Emerald City of Oz was meant to acclimate people to the shiny new America. In the end, all we know for sure is that Baum, inspired by European folk legends, had set out to create one for American children. And whether or not he intended any hidden meanings, its continuing relevance suggests he succeeded in creating a fairy tale America can call its own.
As for today's big question, whether or not populism is an effective way to govern remains up for debate, and we may not yet have enough history to properly judge. In the case of the People's Party, the actual influence of the organization was negligible, but we shouldn't overlook the groundwork that the party was able to lay for future movements on behalf of ordinary Americans. We're still in the process of judging Donald Trump's populism. Will his single term in office have long-term repercussions, as the Populist Party of the 1800s did? Will another candidate seize on the far-right populist momentum that he helped create? Will populists on the left look to replicate the strategy that energized his base? Or will this populist wave quickly subside, as have others in the last 100 years. We'll have to wait and see. But as a general rule, the ability to recognize populist strategy is an important tool for the citizen's tool belt. Next time, we'll turn our attention abroad and witness the United States grow into a global empire. See you then.